Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. I'm in Washington, D.C., where we're going to be speaking about humor in tough times. And these are indeed tough times, and I want to acknowledge up front that I understand how serious the coronavirus is for millions of people around the world, and I want to say good luck to those of you who are recovering, and I'm sorry to those of you who've lost loved ones during this crisis. However, we're going to do this segment about humor and humor in tough times. And I think this is appropriate because even though most of us in the United States and a lot of parts of the world are in stay-at-home orders, that doesn't mean we can't respond in ways that show our humanity. And I think it's important for us to explore humor, comedy, music, the arts, to explore how we deal with crisis situations. So we're going to start today with a professor from the United Kingdom, who's a professor at the University of Kent, who actually teaches about comedy, and he himself has been a stand-up comic. So Ali Double is going to start us off with a discussion about the role of comedy in our civilization.
Comedy can do all kinds of great things. It can make us feel more connected with each other. If we laugh at the same thing, we feel part of the group. Conversely, if you've ever been in a show and everybody else is laughing and you're finding it deeply unfunny, that can be quite alienating. But what that shows us is when it's working, it makes you feel more bonded with other people. It can make you feel part of a wider group as well. Like, you know, if you really is a Doctor Who or something and somebody does a joke about Doctor Who that's really full of Doctor Who specific references, it makes you feel more part of that group. It can also relieve tension, it can make you feel better about the world, it can relieve frustration, and it can help you to smite your enemies with mockery and satire.
You teach a class at the University of Kent about stand-up comedy. Could you talk about some of the aspects of the class for a Higher Education Today audience?
So we start with theory and history. So the students look at all kinds of examples of stand-up from the last 120 years in the UK and the USA primarily. And that builds through looking at various aspects of comic theory and history to them writing an essay, which is an in-depth analysis of a particular short stand-up routine of their choice. They also work with material from the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive, which is something we've set up at the University of Kent to collect material and ephemera to do with the art and craft of stand-up comedy. So that includes all kinds of recordings, both off-air and commercial recordings, and on the other hand, privately made recordings by comedians for their own use. Also script notes, set lists, publicity material, business records, props, costumes, and a load of other stuff beside. And the students directly get to work with that amazing primary source material to help them develop their ideas about stand-up. In the second half of the module, they move on to the practical phase where they start devising and performing their own stand-up routines. And every week they come in and do a different stand-up routine according to a different brief, and they get feedback from me and their sort of peers, and that culminates in a show normally performed at the Gulbenkian Theatre, which is on campus, a public theatre on campus. This year they're doing an online show instead.
Do people of different ages and different places find different things to be funny?
Comedy is very context specific in many cases. So what might be funny today because it's about something that's in people's minds today may not be funny next week when people have forgotten about it or don't feel the same way. What's funny here in Kent might be very funny from what's even funny in London, say. I mean, there might be some local references which are specific to here. And I think comedy often plays on the things that people are the uppermost of people's minds, and that changes over time and it changes over geographical location. So a lot of comedy isn't universal. Of course, you do get universal comedy. You get, well, maybe not universal, but highly transferable comedy. I mean, you might be able to find a joke that was told in ancient Rome that somehow works today. You might be able to find something like Monty Python that's popular all around the world. But actually a lot of really great comedy is culturally specific, is specific to the time and place in which it's generated. I mean, down to the point that if you go to a stand-up gig and something happens on the night that is unique and the comedian gets loads of laughs from playing on it, there's something so magical and special about that feeling. So yeah, we laugh at different things but sometimes we laugh at the same things.
Who gets to define what's funny or what's in bad taste?
Really, there's only one sort of personal group of people who decides what's funny and what's in bad taste, and that's the audience, the particular audience. Whether that audience is an individual who you're talking to, who suddenly disapproves of what you're saying to them, or laughs heartily, or whether it's a stadium full of people, all deciding, or the vast majority deciding that that is funny and they're going to laugh. Some comedians really play on being on the edge of acceptability. In fact, most comedians play on that a little bit, in whatever way and however subtle that may be. But ultimately, they've got to be able to persuade the audience that what they're saying is funny and that they have a right to say it, and that it's not morally bankrupt.
How would you respond to somebody who questions whether or not it's appropriate to laugh during times of crisis?
I think laughing at a time of crisis can be inappropriate in the sense that it can be offensive to some people. To take coronavirus, for example, if you've just lost somebody very close to you from coronavirus, whatever the joke, whatever the motivation, it's probably not going to be very funny to you. On the other hand, we're all going through this extraordinary experience with all these privations that we don't normally experience, and it'd be weird if we weren't joking about them, because joking is a way of relieving tension, it's a way of coping with it, it's a way of perhaps challenging some of the more questionable things that governments are doing. Some of the governments of the world are having reactions to the coronavirus situation which are questionable, and comedy is a way of also putting forward those ideas. So yes, some people might find it unacceptable, but I think for the most of us, we need comedy to kind of keep us sane and keep us human.
At a time when physical movement is restricted, do you think we're going to go back to a kind of physical-based comedy after the restrictions have ended?
It's already happening, and people can't do comedy now in the normal way. People can't go to a comedy club, they can't go to a theatre. And so it's all going online. Also, comedians, of course, are out of pocket because I can't imagine a working comedian today who hasn't lost money on this, whether it's because they've had to cancel a tour or whether it's because their comedy club bookings have all gone. They've suddenly had to cross out everything in their diary. So what comedians are doing, not just for money, but also to kind of, I suppose, keep them busy and keep their following on side, is they're doing stuff, they're posting videos on social media, and they're also live streaming. There's an amazing thing called the Stay at Home Festival in the UK, which is running a weekly comedy club on a Saturday night called the Quarantine Comedy Club, I think, with comedians performing material straight into their webcams. And actually, it's really it's not as good as going to a comedy night because you can't work with the audience as you would in a comedy night. But when you watch it live, the feeling of connectedness with those people talking to us via their webcams is quite tangible, and it's really nice. It's almost like having a night out. What I have to say is, I think as soon as we are allowed to leave our houses again, I think it will go back to live performance because, ultimately it isn't as good seeing somebody performing into a webcam as going to a place and being surrounded by other people who are laughing with you at the same thing.
How has comedy evolved in the last generation or two?
Lots of things have changed with comedy. In the UK there was a sort of revolution in comedy in the 1980s, and the modern style of stand-up was born in the UK at that point, really following a transition that had happened quite a lot earlier in the States. Since then, all kinds of things have happened. Even in the last 20 years, there's been a massive growth in stadium comedy. There's been a huge growth in long-form narrative stand-up shows, particularly because of the Edinburgh Fringe. Probably the best known of those is Hannah Gadsby's Nanette. But there are lots of them, and hundreds, thousands of shows that have been produced by UK comedians, and I think that trend is now starting to be picked up on by comedians in the States as well. There's people who are trying to do something a bit different with comedy, so there's been a sort of resurgence of interest in the kind of ideas that the alternative comedians of the 1980s were doing in the UK in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's in America also there's now a thing called alternative comedy, which I suppose consciously or unconsciously followed the example set by the UK in the early 1980s. All kinds of things have changed, and I think stand-up is going to change. It just will change because it's essentially such a simple form that it means that it's highly flexible and elastic, and people will always find new ways of doing it.
What is it like to be a stand-up comedian? Do people tend to ask you the same questions or pigeonhole you in some way?
What it's like to be a stand-up comedian? Well, there's a lot of boring bits. There's a lot of kind of travelling involved. There's a lot of kind of indigestion from eating a cheese and onion pasty at 2 a.m. from a service station, that kind of thing. There's a thing of constantly mining your thoughts and your experiences for potential material, and constantly having a notebook or a phone to hand to note down ideas, because you're always hungry for the next bit of material. In terms of what people ask you, there are a lot of cliched questions. So some of the or comments that people make. So, how do you remember it all? Well, that's a really backhanded compliment. It should be, how can you be so funny? Not how did you remember it? You want to be praised for your funniness, not your memory. But things like, tell us a joke. That's a really boring thing to be asked. Where do you get your ideas from? Oh, there's an amazing one, which is, when you're on stage, how do you think of funny things to say? As if you only start thinking about it once you get on stage. I think what's lovely about that question is it imagines that stand-up is something you could just conjure up from nothing, which, okay, that does happen sometimes, and some comedians specialise in that, but the vast majority of comedians have a plan, and that plan takes the form of, in whatever form, scripted material, a planned material. But so the fact that people kind of ask you as if they imagine that you think of it on the spot is quite sweetly playing into the fiction that lies behind most stand-up, which is that it's prepared material masquerading as something that's totally spontaneous.
Thank you very much, Ollie. That was terrific. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer those questions. Well, I wanted to emphasize a few things, if I could. One, just thank you for sharing your insights as a comedian and as a stand-up comic in particular, but also from the perspective of someone who spent time in the academic world and is currently at the University of Kent. So I think that's very helpful. You also said two things that I thought were quite important. One was the issue of physical craving and how we crave to be with other people. And yes, it's true that comedy can be funny online, but yes, we do crave to be with other people, whether it's at a concert, whether it's at a comedy club. And I think your point is well taken, and hopefully we will experience that at some point soon. And I'm sure I'm not the only one around the world who thinks that and who hopes for that. You also mentioned the issue of sanity and how humor can help keep us sane. And I think that that's true as well. And I wanted to emphasize that I think that you are 100% right, that can help us in tough times. And that's, in fact, the reason why we're doing this segment. So thank you very much for taking the time all the way from the University of Kent. We're now going to turn to Ohio State University here in the United States. And there is a group at Ohio State called the 8th Floor Improv Comedy Group. And they are an improv group at Ohio State. And one of their members is Trevor Haker, who is from Dayton, Ohio. And Trevor has taken the time to tape for us a 2-minute monologue about what it's like to be at his large house in Ohio all by himself. So Trevor Haker, who's originally from Dayton, Ohio, coming to us from Ohio State University.
Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Trevor Haker. I'm a member of A4 Improv here at The Ohio State University. And well, I know this COVID-19 situation has been affecting us all. And as a comedian, it's been affecting me in the way that I can't go out and, do my material, do improv with my best friends in the world, and kind of do what I love doing most. So that's been a big kind of damper on my life, but there's no problem with that because we're being safe so that we can all come out of this surviving and we can flourish as a people. I've been taking online classes and that's been a lot of fun. My roommates have all moved back to their respective hometowns, so I've kind of had this whole house to myself. It's been a little lonely. Not super lonely though, because I have a sneaking suspicion that while my roommates moved out, some ghostly friends have moved in. There's been a lot of weird stuff going on around the house that makes me think that so basically I think that I now have some paranormal friends as roommates. And you know what? That's all right because I'd rather have some company rather than no company. I can't practice my comedy, but I have found that I'm able to practice my comedy on them. And I can sometimes get a reaction. Usually my jokes make quite a killing. And sometimes they'll, give me some feedback so I can workshop my material. Um, but I know COVID-19 has been affecting us all in our own ways. I hope everybody out there is staying safe, and I hope everybody finds a little something that can make them laugh to help them get through this. So, everybody have a nice day.
Thank you, Trevor, and I hope you get to perform with your classmates and your colleagues from 8th floor soon, and hopefully those ghosts leave you alone. We're now going to turn to another school in Ohio, Ohio Wesleyan University. Actually, more specifically, a graduate from Ohio Wesleyan, Hannah Wargo, who graduated in 2019 from Ohio Wesleyan. Hannah is now camped out in New Jersey while she's working full time for her job, but she is about to tell us about what it's like to work remotely and online, and she's got some things to say that I think are kind of interesting and point to the issue of how different generations are responding to this time period in history, and particularly being left alone to their electronic devices. So, Hannah, take it away. Hannah Wargo from Ohio Wesleyan University, class of 2019.
Hey, it's Hannah here. I'm coming from my beautiful bunker that is obviously not New York City, but is indeed New Jersey. I think one of the biggest changes from working in person to working remote is obviously the use of the internet, which was already previously a pretty big problem. For my organization, I work with a lot of people that have worked in the industry for over 30 years, but they still write their email to me in the subject line. Yes, I've also been forwarded emails that I'm already CC'd on, and I've in total probably spent about 60 minutes on the phone with different clients explaining to them how to use Facebook Live. My boss, I spent 45 minutes on the phone with her the other day while she read to me a Google document that I was reading in front of me. No additional commentary, nothing that wasn't already there, but I guess she just kind of wanted to read it to me. But, I let her because I have nothing else to do anyway. That's the other difficult thing I think about not being in the office is I can't talk her through these email things. So rather than tell her verbally, I already got that email. You don't have to forward it to me. I'm already CC'd. I just get all of the emails and then the texts confirming that I got the emails when I responded to those emails. Since we're not in person, we have to call a lot. And I just want to put this out there. If you're calling me and I gave you my number and you've called me before, it's only me answering the phone. You don't need to check if it's someone else or ask who it is. It's me. If you're calling Hannah, you're going to reach Hannah. That's how cell phones work. Let's keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was terrific. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us from New Jersey. Hannah raised some interesting questions and some interesting points, obviously in a humorous way, about how she's dealing with her boss and dealing with other people in her organization. But it does raise some of the issues that are coming out right now, which is how and what are the most important things, both in the academic world and in the professional world. So what are the things that we can do without? What are the things that are absolutely essential? And I think what Hannah was able to demonstrate to us and for us is to help us see what the most important things are, at least from her perspective. But I think what I'd like to urge all viewers of higher education today to think about right now while you're at home, or if you see this after you're no longer at home, is what are the most essential things of the academic world? What are the key things in academics that we can do without? What are the things that we can't do without? And these are very profound issues that as a society we've never really resolved. because one of the things that's going to happen, of course, is that people are going to say that things like comedy, music, the arts don't bring in as much revenue as the business school or as the engineering school. And while that's probably true, I think what it's also important to do is to think about, when times are tough, what did we turn to as a society? Who did we turn to as a society? And what things kept us going? So while it's important to focus on the bottom line, it's important to focus on what's important economically. I think it's also important to think about what are the key things that are keeping us going in tough times and will keep us going forward. And in that vein, we have with us a comedian about to be with us in a second, is a comedian from Johannesburg, South Africa, Al Progers, who actually does performances at different companies and corporations and entities throughout South Africa. He has joined us from his house in Johannesburg to tell us what it's like to be with his wife and his 2 kids. And I'll let him tell you his own story, but what's interesting is to see his perspectives on what it's like to be cooped up, quote unquote, cooped up in a house. And of course, the definition is, what does it mean to be cooped up, and who's defining the cooping, and how large or small a space do you have? But I'll let Al tell his story. Just for the record, Al is a graduate of the University of Cape Town, where, as viewers of Higher Education Today know, we've done a number of tapings over the years. So special thanks to the University of Cape Town, as always. And let's hear from Al from Johannesburg.
Because around the world, we're in different stages of lockdown, right? I mean, I believe in the US, you can still move around quite freely. Here in South Africa, we are locked down in our homes with no alcohol, no cigarettes, no walking the dog. In some countries, they've probably already taken the swing out of the budgie's cage. But there's an old cliche that says you can have a happy marriage and kids, just not at the same time. But right now, we're appreciating it. We're making the most out of being together, because we're now homeschooling by accident. So far, there's no set curriculum, but the kids do learn creative new words whenever they're playing in the lounge and I take a frisbee on the shin. And we're trying to instill an attitude of gratitude, which basically means that I threaten to take away their screen time whenever they're not grateful for something. The children see me less as a role model and more as a pothole on the information superhighway. Look, even if the house is a bit messy, that's why they invented video calls with blur background. And you might say I'm sloppy at housework, but I say I'm a concerned parent, working hard to just boost their immune systems. You might want to try sharing your hobbies with your kids. Let them learn by doing things. Because actually, I'm a classic car enthusiast. I own a 1972 Toyota Corona, which I daren't drive. I may be the only human on the planet right now who's trying to protect his Corona from the people and not vice versa. So, okay. As we may live on different continents, first world, developing world, but for the first time, it really feels like we're in the same boat. Welcome to economy class. It's cramped. The food's not that great. There are too many of us queuing for the bathroom. But eventually, we're all going to end up in the same place, so we might as well take care of one another. After all, the dirtiest part of another human is probably their mind. Stay healthy. Cheers.
Thank you, Al. Thanks very much for joining us from South Africa. We're now going to turn to Patrick Kabanda. Patrick is originally from Uganda, and he is the author of a book called The Creative Wealth of Nations, which I'm holding right now, which is a terrific book. And in this book, Patrick argues that it's really important for us to focus on the value of the arts, which help keep us sane. And you may remember that earlier in the segment, our friend from the University of Kent made the same exact point, that it's important for our sanity to focus on comedy and the arts. Patrick is making it from the perspective of the arts. I will let Patrick say his thoughts in his own words. Patrick is a graduate of Juilliard and Tufts University. And Patrick, who's originally from Uganda, wrote this terrific book that was published by the Cambridge University Press. Take it away, Patrick.
In this extremely challenging time of the coronavirus pandemic, it's refreshing to see that from Italy to the United States, people are turning to the arts to make meaning of what's happening, to connect with others, and to stay sane. This just goes on to show how the arts are part of who we are and how they are a major fabric that connects the human spirit. As it happens, in 2018, my book called The Creative Wealth of Nations was published. In this book, I talk about how the arts can enrich our lives beyond money. And it's refreshing to see that right now, around the world, people are putting into practice some of the things I talk about in this book. And I hope when this is all over, when we are through this, we will look back and remember how the arts helped us to go through this. And I hope we will continue to elevate them in our lives all the time, always, and in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was terrific, and that was really a helpful overview of why the arts are so important. Not just comedy, but all of the arts are important to our society. One of the things that Patrick didn't mention, because he didn't have time, which I think I'd like to say a word or two about, is the economic value of the arts. Not just the artistic value of the arts, not just the emotional aspect and the emotional strength that it brings us, but there's also an economic value that, think about big artistic venues around the world that bring in revenue, that bring in speakers, that bring in performers, and enrich our lives artistically, musically, and of course, economically as well. So thank you all for your special contributions to this special edition of Higher Education Today. And to you, our viewers, thank you for taking the time to tune in to another edition of the show. If you would like to send a message to me, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.